Hello, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Manuscript. I am your host, Cooper Anderson, and today's episode is going to be a little different than normal. Normally, I like to come on the show and show a bit more energy and try to, make it really engaging for all of our listeners here. But given the subject matter of today's book, I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to give this episode, the book, and my guest the seriousness and gravitas that it kind of demands. So today's book is actually a true story, and it starts off with a house fire in 2011 where in the aftermath my guest actually finds a box of letters, photographs, postcards, all written in Hungarian from the early 1900s. With the help of Hungarian lawyer and sociologist Andrus Gazitsky, my guest found an entire saga's worth of information about the Politzer family and the incredibly tragic stories surrounding it. Here today to talk more about this amazing find and the journey of discovery, then writing it all into her book, The Politzer Saga, please help me in welcoming my guest, Miss Linda Ambrus Broenniman. Hi, Linda. How are we doing today?
Great. How are you, Cooper? And thank you so much for having me on your show. I really
Yeah,
appreciate this opportunity to talk about my family stories.
absolutely. When I first heard about it, and the just the way that the story kicks off with, kind of a family tragedy of there being, a house fire, and then discovering something that took you on this big, big journey of family discovery and exploring all these different things. I kind of had to have you on the show. I think at that point, and so
Thank,
I'm so excited that you're here today, and I can't wait to get started. But
thank.
people are tired of hearing me talk, and so please, for the audience, can you tell us all about how this got started and how this book came to be?
Well, just a little bit of background first. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. I was the American-born daughter of what who I thought were Catholic Hungarian parents
Hmm.
who had survived World War II and came to the U.S. to start a new life. And they raised me and have six siblings in Buffalo, and we had a great childhood. But in 1983, I was about 27 years old. My sister accidentally found out that actually my great grandmother was Jewish, which meant my father was Jewish. Um, so at the time, I really didn't do anything about it. But fast forward to what you had said, and there was a couple other things that happened in between, but in 2011, my parents' house caught fire. And mysteriously, I actually think miraculously, this box was saved and found. My sister had saved it, and it got stuck in the back of her closet. So it wasn't until 2015 when I decided I was going to start looking into my family history that my sister happened to find the box in the back of her closet and sent it to me. And here was just this amazing treasure trove of information that started us on this journey.
Nice. And so, having been raised Catholic myself, how did it feel to discover that, your family history is much more broad than what you were initially taught growing up?
Oh, yes. Well, it at first, as I said, I found out when I was 27 years old, and I was just really busy. I was in business school and trying to figure out what my career was going to be. So it didn't really affect me at the time. But, and I can say religion wasn't really important in my life,
Hmm.
but I was just so proud of finding these Jewish ancestors and learning about their stories was just an amazing journey. It's
Hmm.
been life changing for me.
Sure. Do you want to talk a little bit more about those stories that you're telling? Just because I'm coming from a place where I know a lot because I've read parts of the book already,
Yeah.
everything. But the people at home, like they want to hear more about the more fascinating things that
Well,
we'll explore later on as well.
yeah. So what was amazing about this? is through our research, we found a couple books that were written by relatives, and one of those books actually took the stories back to the 1700s. So
Mm,
that's where we started. And I learned, for example, I learned about my great grandfather from the 1700s. Um, his name was Isaac, and at that time, Jews really didn't use surnames; they used patronyms. So he was known
mm-hmm,
as Isaac, son of Moses. And later on, and he has an amazing story. It's just an incredible story of how he had to flee persecution.
mm,
But the reason I bring him up is how we got the name Pulitzer. Is At that time, the Austro-Hungarian Empire sort of, that's where everyone was from, and um, and they required Jews to take on surnames for the purpose of tax control. They wanted to start taxing them and monitoring them.
mm,
And um, so they would give Jews their names, and the names could be anything based on how they looked, how
mm,
they, with their wealth, Goldstein, Silverstein, um, what their profession were, or where they were from. And my great grandfather was from the town of Politz, which actually happens to be the same town that Joseph Pulitzer is from.
mm.
So a lot of Pulitzers are from the town of Politz, and we could be related distantly, but at any rate, that's how we got the name Pulitzer. And I will say it's a name that I didn't even know about.
Mm.
So when I found this box, I found a family tree that had a lot of names I hadn't heard about. So that was just amazing to start to explore these people that I had never heard of.
Yeah. So to kind of keep continuing down the family line, then, when did your family emigrate from Hungary and like over to America?
Yeah, my parents came after World War II. So
Mm-hmm.
after World War II, they actually first went to Switzerland to finish their
Mm,
medical degrees.
mm,
And then after they finished their medical degrees, they spent a half a year in Paris at the Pasteur Institute. And then they were recruited here by Thomas Jefferson Medical University,
mm,
and they came here in 1949.
mm.
So, and then came to Buffalo in 1955.
Gotcha. Very. And so, as a little bit more about my personal background here, I've spent multiple years kind of traveling and working in multiple countries, kind of around the world. And while I know I wouldn't trade those kind of experiences for anything, I also do kind of tell other people, they're like, oh yeah, so you can go off and have adventures, but you also have to remember that you're not really laying down any kind of roots, or there's not a huge sense of stability a lot of times with something like that. Do you think that could have impacted your parents, especially coming
Oh,
off of World War II?
I think very, very much so. They had just lived, been through horrors.
Mm,
My father had been in a Nazi labor camp
yeah,
and escaped. My mother hid Jews during that time, so
yeah,
they had risked their lives. And I think what they wanted to come to a place where they could build a stable life. But I don't think those traumatic events ever, you
mm,
never escape those. They
right,
are always with you. Um,
mm,
and so for me, just to take it a little step further, for me, I felt like I didn't have roots because
yeah,
we didn't have grandparents. My grandmothers lived with
mm,
us, but we didn't have grandparents. They wouldn't talk about their history.
yeah,
So I felt like I didn't have roots. So
yeah,
finding these roots has been an amazing journey for me.
yeah. So that's really interesting just to talk about a what I think is a uniquely kind of American experience, right? One thing that I genuinely do love about America is that if you are coming from another country into America, you have opportunities to really reinvent yourself, right? You
Absolutely.
can grow a business, you can get an education, you can, find love and start a family. There's a lot of opportunities in America specifically. And one thing that kind of comes with it is if you don't want to be connected to your past or your home country there, it is perfectly socially and culturally acceptable just to be like, hey, I'm just an American now. And so I think that can be a good thing, but at the same time, it is disconnecting from family ties, from you're away from that family tree, like you said, where you don't have a huge connection to the past generations. So one question I do want to ask, and feel free to say no if you want to, but can you talk a little bit more about your father's time serving in a labor camp
Yeah,
in
well,
northern Hungary? Yeah.
what's really interesting is when I found this out, and I was in shock because I really had no idea that he had served in a labor camp. And it was clearly, we don't know that much about it because what we do know is that he escaped, and he escaped with five other men who were in it, and they were captured twice,
Mm,
and then finally made it back on the train. But all of them must have had this pact of silence,
mm,
because when we tried to reach out, and Andras knew some of the descendants from the others, and he tried to reach out to see what they knew, and nobody knew anything. There was
mm,
this complete pact of silence. But the others were interesting people in and of themselves. One became a world famous economist, and came to Harvard and was teaching at Harvard. Another was a world class pianist who mostly was known for his Beethoven pieces. So, these people all had incredible careers afterwards,
mm.
but none of them would speak about it. And the only thing that we learned was the Economist had a website, and on his website he said the camp was bombed, most of the people died, but we were lucky to escape, and that's all we knew, really.
Do you think that it's maybe not so much a vow or pact of silence between them, or as much as, hey, this was incredibly traumatic for us, and we kind of just want to move on with our lives, in which they did, and they grew their careers and
Right.
everything. But again, this is kind of a wholly interesting, unique thing for the different generations of Holocaust survivors, right?
Absolutely.
Of family members and offspring, they obviously have questions and curiosities, but in the act of asking them can bring up trauma of the worst kind. and and I don't think and I don't really blame people who say, you know what, I kind of just want to not deal with this. I kind of want to just move on with my life. And while incredibly frustrating for those who are like, no, no, we want to learn and share this pain as a family and kind of deal with it kind of a family, but initially starting with the person who's suffered through it the most, would be incredibly hard and
Yeah.
incredibly difficult. And we kind of
Yeah.
kind of see that through as like the just echoes and the ripples throughout the generations of how this is kind of affecting families for sure.
Right. It is interesting, though. I will tell you, there was one story I learned that I think is an amazing story, so I want to share it.
Please.
One of the sons had reached out to my father and was asking him questions, and he found a little bit out from his father. So one of the things they learned was they had gotten, somehow they got money and must and clothes. They probably didn't have clothes. They got money, and they were on the train back to Budapest, and they happened to sit in a car with a Nazi soldier, but
Wow.
they were all fluent in German. So they started
Mm.
striking up a conversation in German. And when the officer came to check on their papers, he didn't the conversation was so lively, he didn't end up interrupting them, which probably saved their butt because I'm sure they
Yeah.
didn't have papers.
Yeah.
But when they arrived in Budapest, the Nazi soldier turned to them and said, I have enjoyed this conversation so much. I wish all Hungarians were just like you.
Hmm.
So to me, which is just this
Yeah.
amazing statement, and
Yeah.
it's a statement that for me says it all, because I
Sure.
think if we could all have just conversations,
Yeah.
we could all learn how to get together.
It's like I think it's a big missing part of the equation that we're dealing with right now is just the complete lack of empathy, right? If you are forced to empathize with someone, it makes their extermination or subjugation that much harder to do. And frankly, if forced to do, I think it's almost impossible at that point. You're like, no, no, no. These when you stop treating people as objects and start treating them as people, they then you have to treat them like people because you yourself are a person. And I'm
Right.
like, it's kind of built into human nature a bit if you get past that first hurdle.
Yeah.
So I definitely agree for sure. Now, granted, the complexities of geopolitics and racism and just discrimination are well more complicated than just hey, just talk more. But that's never going to hurt, and I definitely think it's a great place to start for
It's a
sure.
great place to start.
So, in that kind of regard, can you talk or can you tell us a little bit more about the Pulitzer exhibit in the Rumbach Synagogue,
Yes.
which is in Budapest, and let's see, and the celebration is being held on September. Is that right?
Well, it actually was. It was last September.
Oh, it's last
Yeah.
September.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Last September. No, that's okay. So what happened was, as Ambrus was doing all of his research, a lot of his research was being done at the Hungarian Jewish Museum and Archives, and they have, these amazing old books that have birth records and death records, all sorts of things, and they're handwritten, gigantic books in their basement. So he was going through that, and then talking to people, asking people. Well, at the same time that he was doing that, there's a synagogue, and it's a beautiful, beautiful synagogue. It was called the Rombach Synagogue, um, that was being renovated. It had been, destroyed in World War II and was never really renovated. So they put in a lot of money to bring it back to its original glory, and it's a stunning building. But they decided that they wanted to do a permanent exhibit, and the reason for the exhibit was to encourage others and inspire others to learn more about their backgrounds. Because Hungary, after World War II, it was communist till,
Hmm.
1990, basically, 1989, 1990. And the communists were just as anti-Semitic, and didn't
Yeah.
allow any religions at all.
Yeah.
So so they wanted to do this exhibit to inspire others. And when they found out that we had been able to go back to 8 generations, they said, could we use your stories for the exhibit? And it's a beautiful exhibit. Peter Forgach, who is a world-renowned documentarian, did basically 10 films, and the films are all based on all my family's stories.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Um, and so, why is that exhibit especially important to your great uncle Zygmunt Pulitzer?
Yeah, so Zygmunt Pulitzer, and he was I don't remember when he was born. He was born in the 1800s and died in 1920. But first of all, he was a member. He held seats at the Rumbach Synagogue. Most of the
Mm.
other family members held seats at the Dohane Synagogue, which is another synagogue in Budapest, one of the biggest actually in the world. Um, but he had held seats at the Rumbach, and he was the one who wrote our family. It was a book called Our Family History, where we learned a lot of these early stories. So it was, yeah, it was really. I think he's looking up and thanking us for doing this.
So through your efforts and writing this book and discovering all this stuff, have you met any new relatives from all this?
Oh yes. So during the research, I found an invitation to a wedding, to for a cousin,
Hmm.
and it turns out he actually is the great great grandson of Sigmund Pulitzer.
Mm.
And he lives in California, and we connected, and it's just been a wonderful relationship since. So it's been incredible. And he actually came to Budapest with us for the celebration.
Mm.
But what was interesting when we first met, he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, you have the same mannerisms as my mother."
Mm.
So it's what's incredible is these things carry through.
Yeah.
And when we were in Budapest, and a very close friend of mine came also to the celebration, and she took a look at him and she said, I hadn't seen it, but she said, "Oh my God, he looks exactly like your dad."
Mhm.
So it's incredible that these genes really seem
Yeah.
to cross,
Hmm.
how strong they are. But
Yeah.
actually, it's also interesting that since I wrote the book, several Pulitzers have reached out, and we are exploring whether there are connections. And I think there are, because, as I said, most Pulitzers came from the same town of Pulitz,
Hmm.
and probably many of us are related. So
Gotcha. So
interesting.
in that kind of sense, there, do you have any major goals on what you want to achieve with this book?
Well, when I originally started writing the book, when I say I just started writing because
Hmm.
I didn't think it was actually going to be a book. I never thought of myself as an author. But what happened is, as we learned these stories, I found that I had to really research history. I didn't know history, and I spent a lot of time learning, reading, and learning about the times that they lived in, so I could understand sort of why they did things and where they were coming from. So the best way for me to put it all down and to make sense of it was to write these stories, and that's how the book sort of came about. But other people have found the books very inspirational, I think, in for two reasons. One, it's I think it has inspired them to research their own history and to
Hmm.
realize how important history, our personal histories, can be. And second, I think these stories, these people are very inspirational. I mean, they
Hmm.
almost sound like fictional characters in these stories, but no, they were real. And what they faced just cataclysmic events,
Yeah.
and still maintained their generosity and their spirit, and the
Yeah.
resilience is remarkable. So to me, these stories are inspirational and very relevant in for today. So
Absolutely. I
yeah.
couldn't agree more with that. Sure. Um, so we're kind of running out of time here a little bit. What's next for you? I know you got this big thing, but are you working on anything now? Can we expect anything in the future? Anything like that?
Well, that's a great question. When I first wrote the book, I had written a lot more chapters, and I worked with an editor, and she said, "You really need to split this into two books." So at some point, I think I'm going to go back and write the other piece that hadn't been written, but
Hmm.
not there yet. But hopefully, I will be. So,
Gotcha. Well, if you ever do, feel free to come back on the show. I'd love
oh,
to have you and
thank you,
talk more about it for sure.
thank you.
Yeah. So last question here is, where can people find your stuff?
So I have a website called www.pulitzersaga.com. And through that website, or you can go directly to Amazon or Barnes and Noble, pretty much any place books are sold.
Mhm.
And it is in a bookstore in Buffalo. If you happen to be in Buffalo, it's at Talking Leaves. So that's another place.
Awesome.
Great.
Yeah, and of course, the links to everything is, of course, going to be in the description down below. So,
Great.
yeah, I highly recommend all their listeners here. Please go pick up your copy of the Pulitzer Saga, available now on Amazon and everywhere else you can probably get books. Linda, I want to thank you so much for coming onto the show today. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Oh, Cooper, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be on your show. So thank
Um,
you.
no problem.